We are now recording part 7 of our beginner's tutorial. So far we covered HTML, CSS, we managed to create components and we turned them into variants in Figma. We converted those into CSS. Now we are going to add more to our CSS knowledge base and understand how CSS properties work. We only managed to explore few CSS properties. Another important property to explore in CSS is called font family. So in Figma, if I go ahead and select my button and if I basically hold command on my keyboard, I'm able to highlight over my text element. So I can click on that and you see on the right hand side, we have something called typography. And typography has a property called basically font family. If I try to inspect this using Figma dev mode, here as soon as I basically hover over Figma dev mode, Figma tells me that the property that is using behind the scene is font-family and it is setting it to enter. Hopefully I'm pronouncing the font family correctly, but if you try to change the font family, let's just go ahead and on my basically main component. If I want to multi-select them, all I can do is basically click and hold command on my keyboard. So if I hold command and I click, as you can see on the top right side, Figma allows me to multi-select. So I can multi-select by adding that. As soon as I multi-select, the multi-select is enabled for me. And now I can go ahead and choose my font family. In this example, I'm just going to randomly choose another font. And now if I go back to the Figma dev mode, here you see Figma actually is changing the font family to something else. Most of the fonts are actually hosted on Google Fonts. So I'm going to click outside, hold Command and Z, basically revert this back to original. Also, if I navigate to Visual Studio Code, I'm able to see my fonts. However, you see that they are a bit different and they don't look exactly like Figma because we are not correctly linking our primary button and secondary button to the correct font family. And as I mentioned, if you decide to use fonts in your projects when it comes to web development, you have to always use Google Fonts. They're the best, and installing it in your Visual Studio Code is very easy. Figma even uses Google Fonts as well. So if I go ahead and try to search for a font, for example, enter that we had, here you see we have the ability to select that enter, which is exactly the same font that is being used on Figma side. So what you can do is you can click on the actual font and you can scroll down. You can see that it has a lot of different font weights, all the way from 100. If you go a little bit lower, all the way down, it has all the way to 900. And this is how font weights work. 900 being like extra bold and 100 being like extra thin. So in order for you to link this font in Visual Studio Code, all you have to do is click the Get Font. Usually the Google fonts move this button around and they usually change the name of it. But as of now, the Get Font is here. So as soon as I click that, here you see we have now selected our font, and what matters is we don't need to download the font because we don't want to use it locally. We want to actually use it on the browser. So what we care about is the embed code. So if I click on the embed code, I'm navigated to the embed code basically screen, and I have the ability to switch between different projects that I want to embed this to. And as you can see, this font is variable, which means we have the ability to select any font weight all the way from 100 to 900. And if I navigate back to Figma, I can hold command on my keyboard and basically select over these two fonts. And if I scroll down and if I try to click on this font weight here, you see we have the ability to select from 0 to basically 900. However, Figma renames it from thin to black all the way. Also, we have the ability to choose variable font. And if we do that, we're now brought to the variable font page. And in this panel in Figma, I now have the ability to actually add a custom value. Instead of sticking with 200, which is a fixed value, I have the ability to choose any variable font weight that I want. And then right now you see if I close this panel, Figma updates that font weight to a variable font. It no longer tells me that this is bold or thin. It actually gives it a variable value, which means on the Google side, all I have to do is basically copy that embed code. And Google even tells you the instruction. It tells you to embed the code in the head of your HTML. We already covered HTML structure before in previous parts. What the head tag allows us to do is basically link our style sheet. In this example, if we do have a lot of CSS in our file, we can link it in the head tag. And in this example, if we do want to bring external styles and fonts from Google, we would just need to copy that link and add it to our HTML head tag. As you can see on the Google side, we have the ability to copy all these link tags. So what I can do is basically click copy, navigate back to Visual Studio Code, and then I can scroll all the way up. Here you see my basically code is being all the way overflowed on the other side. You can simply ignore that, but we have already covered that shortcut. You can always wrap your code using toggle word wrap. So I would basically do that. So this would wrap the line of code for me. So I no longer need to scroll to left and right. And what I would do is basically go and create a new line break, and right after my meta tag in my head HTML, I would just simply Command V and paste those links that I copied from Google. And then all I have to do is hold Command and S to save that. Since I copied this, I no longer need this to be wrapped. So what I can do is toggle that again, holding Option and Z. And as you can see, as soon as I do that, it actually is going to overflow on the screen. So if I do want to see that, I can scroll on the right side to see that. If you are done with a parent element, what you can do is hover over it. Here you see on my Visual Studio Code, if I hover over it, this tiny icon on the left side appears, and this allows me to collapse this. So I have an easier time looking at my code. So this way, if I no longer need the head tag, if I already copy pasted my Google fonts and I embedded it in my project, I can simply hover over my parent element, which is head tag, and as you can see, I have my drop down icon here, so I can collapse this range and I can now focus on my HTML element. So on the Figma side, you don't need to do that because Figma already uses the API to add that enter font to your project, so you are basically saving one step. But in the Visual Studio Code, you have to go that extra step to link this. And then finally, once you link this, what matters is one extra line of code, which is font-family. And as you can see, it is set to enter, and then it adds a comma and it gives it a sans serif value. So what does that mean? So in CSS, if you decide to use fonts, you have to always have a fallback. In this example, we are telling CSS that make sure to use the Google font that I selected and I embedded to my project. In this example is enter. And then I do add a comma. That means I'm separating that value, and I tell the browser that if you don't find this font in my project, and if the user on the other end who's viewing my project doesn't have this font, make sure to use any sans serif font that is similar to enter. You can also declare your fonts like that, font-family sans serif with no quotation mark, because sans serif is a value that is preserved and it's a keyword. Same thing as the font family, which is a keyword in CSS properties. So if I go ahead and only just write that, it is going to work. However, I need to add this value to link to my font and then use comma and the keyword sans serif as a fallback. Again, on the Google side, whatever font you use, you have to always make sure you use the correct naming, which means if you're using enter, Google is renaming this with capital I and basically all lowercase. So if you have chose enter, you have to make sure you spell it this way. So what I can do is I can basically copy that, navigate back to my Visual Studio Code, and now I can basically go ahead and in my primary button, add a return, paste that, and then as you can see here, it basically generates all those for me. I really don't care about that. All I care about is font-family, enter, comma, sans serif. So I can do basically highlight that, copy that to my clipboard, Command Z that to remove the extra codes that I don't need, and I can basically Command V that to paste this. And if I save this, right now you see on the right hand side, all my fonts are exactly taking the same font family as my Figma project. I can also click on my browser to make the zoom level a little bit lower to 175 so we don't have gigantic massive buttons. The actual default view, this is the basically 100% is the default view, so this is how your users will see your web pages. Again, this is Figma, and the way you build your stuff in Figma, you have to always view that on 100% zoom level in the browser to make sure that they're accurate, and this is how users would view your pages. The reason I click on the browser and I hold basically Command and equal sign or plus to zoom in, so you guys have easier time seeing the difference. But if you do decide to test your designs, you have to always revert back to 100% zoom level. And what you notice is right now on my primary button, sign up, buy, and cancel, I actually got the font. However, the second cancel, which is set to my secondary button, didn't get the font family. what you can do is simply copy that value and then go ahead to my secondary button class and paste that and then save this. And as soon as I do that, you see my cancel, which has the secondary button class, also get the font. But what you notice is we are repeating a lot of CSS properties over and over again. It would be nice if we can actually group them. So in Figma, the way you group stuff is not the same way in CSS. For example, if I go to Figma and if I try to use the same font size and the same padding, I have no way to basically create a reusable padding size and apply it to my elements. I do have some options. For example, I can click and basically hover over my text element, and in this example we're using 12 pixels, and I can go ahead and click this text style and click plus and then just give it a reusable style. For example, I can just give it button dash text and then create my style. And then if I click outside here, all I need to do is also link it to my second button. So all I have to do is select the text on my second button, and instead of manually modifying the typography, I would now select the text styles, and now I have the ability to select my reusable text. So I can click that, and if I click outside, now under my local styles, I have something called the text style, which is set to the button text. So if I go ahead and click on that tiny settings icon and I bring that up, for example, down the line, I try to go with 24 pixels. You see, as soon as I change one single text style, the rest of the elements get the update. So in CSS, we have classes. So what we can do is we can actually group the classes together and give them the font value that way. So two approaches. Let's just go ahead. For example, let's select 14 pixels, and instead of 672, let's just go ahead and choose 450, for example. Close that, close that. Now I'm happy with my text style. And then as you can see in CSS, we use comma again to group our CSS selectors. So the way it works is we would select our first HTML element and we follow it by a comma, and then whatever comes after that would be grouped with the first HTML element. That means all the properties and values that you group will be applied to both elements. Again, in this example, we are grouping 3 elements here. In our example, we only have primary button and secondary button, so we're only grouping 2. But the key character that we need to use is the comma to be able to group our elements. So if I navigate back to Visual Studio Code, I have to now look at the properties that are being used in both primary button and the secondary button that is similar. In this example, we have a font family. And then as you can see, if you hover over certain characters in Visual Studio Code tries its best to find the next match. And as you can see, it actually highlights the other match that it finds. So what I can now do is group primary button and secondary button in another style and cut that from both of them and add it to my group CSS selectors. So right now I would just go ahead and copy the primary button. So I'll just create line breaks. I have my, again, primary button. Now I add the key character, which is a comma. And now I would go ahead and copy my secondary button. And now I would paste this and I would add my curly braces, open a new line, and I know that the font family is the one that is being repeated. So I would cut that from one of them and then go ahead and delete that from the other one and click inside the declaration block, and I would paste this. And then as soon as I save this, Visual Studio Code reformats this for me. But right now you see the result is exactly identical. What we did on our end is we grouped our CSS classes. The other common elements between them is the border radius, and as you can see, if I try to hover over it, Visual Studio Code selects the other match for me. So I would just cut that, Command and X, basically paste that here, and I will have to make sure to delete that from the secondary button. And then as you can see, the padding and the display is exactly identical. So what I would do is cut that as well, paste this here, and I would basically remove that from the other one. And if I go ahead and save this, right now it's so much easier for me to reuse my style, which means if I have to now change the padding for both of my buttons, I don't need to go to my primary button and change this and also go ahead and update that in my secondary button. Since I grouped these two, if I decide to, for example, use 40 pixels, I just do 40 pixels. And then if I save this, all of my buttons, regardless of their classes, whether they're primary or secondary, will get the update. So if I go ahead and save this, right now you see all my buttons got the update. And again, down the line, you might have ghost button, which has a different colors, or a text button, and all you have to do is basically add comma and group the similar styles that are applied in all of them, and also individually select them to give them the unique values. And as you can see, I didn't apply the color when I was grouping them, because if I do add the color when I'm grouping them, all of these would get the update, and I don't want that. I want to make sure that the color and the background color is unique, and only these 4 properties are similar in between them. So I would go ahead and Command Z that and save this, and then as you can see, all of these get the update instantly. So the way you would reuse your style is by grouping them in CSS, selecting your elements. In this example, you have a text, so I would go ahead and create my reusable style in text. However, Figma doesn't have that much ability at the moment. And then as you can see, if I decide to have the same padding 16 pixels and 8 pixels applied to all of my button as a CSS class, I don't have that ability in Figma. I have to also mention, yes, you have the ability to go ahead and create a local variable, and then as soon as you do that, you have the ability to add a number, but this is exactly not ideal. You are only adding one number, but in CSS you can again have paddings applied in 4 directions. In this example, we have 8 pixels of top and bottom and 16 pixels of left and right being reused in both primary button and secondary button.